Yes, we know that.
Right, so the life of Violet Mary Firth, who later became Dion Fortune. Arthur Firth met Sarah Jane Smith, known to her friends as Jenny, which is interesting because Jenny is a derivative of Guinevere. So really, when Arthur and Jenny married on the 19th of August 1886 in the Church of St Mary the Virgin, Limpy Stoke, it was the union of Arthur and Guinevere, who this time would one day produce a sea priestess to save the country. Violet Mary Firth made her entrance into this world on the 6th of December 1890 at Limpy Lodge, Brinnaby, on Hill of the Bow, which was purposely built for the owners and managers, which were Violet's parents and grandparents, of the Craigside Hydro, Llandudno. Incidentally, whilst the family were waiting for the building to be completed, they resided at Picton Farm, Prestatyn. The Craigside Hydro was demolished in the 1970s to make way for a housing estate, but not the lodge. The night of her birth, Violet stopped breathing, but her mother held her all night, refusing to believe she was dead. But she knew the eyes that looked at her the next morning were different to the previous night. Her daughter was a changeling. Even her name would connect her with what she was later to become, as Violet means modesty in the language of flowers, and Mary comes from the Hebrew Mara, which means bitter sea and links to the great sea of life. And Firth means sea inlet. Is it merely coincidence such a child would later become known as the sea priestess? This was all overlooking the little Orm. It is thought Orm is derived from the Scandinavian worm or dragon. There are lots of legends associated with both Orms, amongst them the tale of Helig's Palace in the lost land of Tyno Helig from the 6th century. In fact, the palace is said to have been some 2 miles from today's coastline, now under the waters of Colwyn Bay. Locally, this is compared to Atlantis and even known as the Welsh Atlantis. We know from the age of 4, Violet had visions of Atlantis. Was it the Welsh Atlantis? The details a 4-year-old, as had never left Wales, gave were incredible. Things like feather duster trees, were they tree ferns, maybe before the hardwood forests evolved? Botanists confirm that grassy vegetation would have been around those tree ferns, as most of today's bushes had yet to evolve. But how did 4-year-old Violet know this? She describes small basket work huts that poor fisher folk lived in when they weren't out fishing in their small round basket boats. They would often not return because the lolloping beasts she described inhabiting the waters ate them. Just as the fisher people's huts were to be avoided by young children, was the fisher people who want to eat any strange children they could catch. She knew her home was a safe place in the caves of the distant mountains. Violet would also have been able to gaze across the sea to the Druid Isle of Inismore or Anglesey. Sure you will agree, a very magical place for our sea priestess to have been born. It was Dion Fortune's belief that at the moment of sexual union, a psychic vortex is formed, resembling a water spout, a funnel-shaped swirling that towers up into other dimensions. As body after body engages, the vortex goes up the planes. In all cases, the physical, etheric, and astral bodies are involved. The vortex, therefore, always reaches as far as the astral plane. A soul upon the astral plane may be drawn into this vortex if it is ripe for incarnation, and thus enter the sphere of the parents. If the vortex extends higher than the astral plane, souls of a different type may enter this sphere, but such extension is rare, and therefore it is said that man is born of desire, but few are born of anything else. And that's a quote from Psychic Self-Defense. In the 1901 census, the whole family can be found running Sheen House, Sheen Lane, Mortlake, Surrey. And this was after the death of Violet's grandmother, Jenny, who had wished to be buried in Limpy Stoke, where she had spent such happy times and even witnessed her daughter married there. John was said to be heartbroken by her death. He became even more devoted to his beloved granddaughter and felt her poetry was worthy of publishing in a book entitled Simply Violets. It's a good thing he did, as it not only gives us an insight into the young Violet, but also a photograph of Violet as she was then. Incidentally, this residence was also once the home of the legendary alchemist and sorcerer Dr. John Dee. Crowley and many others have been responsible for developing Dee's works, but he is much admired by anyone studying the Hermetic arts. Violet and her family were uprooted from this address to 53 New Broad Street, London, by her father Arthur, on the death of her beloved grandfather John Smith in 1906 from bronchopneumonia. Arthur did no traceable work in the next few years, but he must have felt very secure in the knowledge that his father-in-law John Smith left him and his wife Jenny the princely sum of £1,477, 16 shillings and 9pence. Violet always claimed to be an orphan child born in Yorkshire, brought up by a family of Christian Scientists. The orphan part is a myth, as we know her birthplace and family. The second unlikely, as Christian Science did not arrive in England until 1898, when the first church was founded in London. There is a record of her parents having a connection with the Christian Science church, though. In 1906, when Violet was about 16 and they had moved to London, she and her parents joined. Indeed, her mother Jenny went on to become a registered Christian Science practitioner. But why would she hide her Welsh beginnings when it was such a magical place? It's likely that Violet attended Hugh Sex's school, which was held in Cedar Tree House, Stoughton. A nearby two-storey barn was adapted for a classroom. The headmaster, from 1897 to his retirement in 1923, was Edward Henry Smith, who wrote a book on retirement stating that many churches built on hills, looking out to sea, or even on rocky islands close to the mainland, are dedicated to St. Michael. Was it he who first pointed this out to Violet? There's a photograph of Sex's school wagon on Dusty Road, or possibly the beach at Breen, with some pupils, one of whom looks like a young Violet from the one proven photograph of her when young, that does exist. It looks likely, and an aged local swears it is, but some do dispute it. It's here she would have become familiar with Breen Down and began a lifelong love affair with the place. Breen Down, like the Great and Little Orme and Glastonbury Tor, is another rocky outcrop of carboniferous limestone. Prodding out into the sea at the end is the remains of an old fort, built in 1866 to hold 30 men and 20 horses. It was also armed with enough guns of Firth steel facing seawards to blast any intruder who dared to venture up the Bristol Channel. 2 limestone quarries were on the north side, but more interestingly is the old stone circle on the top, and a later Roman temple to a now unknown god. Violet felt sure in later years that the end of the finger pointed to the lost temples of Atlantis. Violet definitely attended Studley Agricultural College in Warwickshire from 1911 January to December 1912. This was described as a semi-nursing home for neurotic young girls. It was part of a castle set in 40 acres of gardens and 250 acres of farmland. The old stables and outbuildings were converted to dairies, lecture rooms, cheese rooms, jam rooms, all manner of things to help young ladies recuperate. Violet was even so successful with the chickens during her stay here that she was employed from January 1913 to April of the same year. She talks of her time here in her book Psychic Self-Defense, although she deliberately obscures her time she was there, possibly to avoid causing offence or even being sued. She describes in details how she dealt magically with a bullying warden here, thought to be Dr. Lilas Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton was quite a remarkable adversary, qualifying from Edinburgh University at a time when it was very rare for a female to pursue such a profession. During her time at Studley, she was remembered by pupils as being most odd, a strong, determined, contradictory character who would ride motorcycles, sleep out on the lawn with her false teeth in a glass beside her. She dressed flamboyantly and wore a ginger wig with her own hair poking through the top of it. She took great risks. She also had a great personal magnetism and taught her pupils an awful lot. It's no wonder the young Violet only managed to thwart her, not defeat in the inner combat. Interestingly, she too died on January the 6th, 1925, some 21 years before Violet. Indeed, this was the reason she had to escape the place, because of suffering a nervous breakdown, which took Violet over a year to recover from. During this time, she would do sums from an old school arithmetic book to keep her mind from falling apart. Eventually, she was taken to the family GP, who declared she had been hypnotised. This was prior to psychotherapy study, of course. He gave her a tonic, which she found useful, and bromide, which she didn't, as it reduced her powers of resistance. This she couldn't allow, as she still felt the attack could resume at any moment. Melchizedek became an important part of Violet's life not long after this, not only because he was master of the order to which she belonged, being a woman she wasn't delusional enough to claim for herself, but she often referred to it in the sleeping priestess theme she used in her later novels. In her efforts to rebuild her broken ego, Violet took to studying psychology, which was the in thing of the time. Freud, Jung, and Adler would later represent love, will, and power, like the three rays in Violet's later cosmology. No formal qualifications were needed to study psychology in those days, and although unrecognised by the British Medical Association, Violet became one of the first female psychologists. She was at this point in her mid-20s and referred to as a lay analyst, albeit the highest paid lay analyst in London just before the First World War. Whilst records of the time have been destroyed, Violet often spoke of the time at medico-psychological clinic in Brunswick Square. Her patients' problems would be such things as homosexuals of both sexes, unmarried mothers, and even folk who would compulsively masturbate. The latter formed a large part of her clients. Whilst here, she was consulted by one of her students who had a patient lodging with her and her roommates whilst they received treatment at the clinic. The roommates were baffled why the French window leading onto the balcony would fly open at the same time each evening, just after a dog in a neighbouring property began to bark and howl furiously. They had consulted locksmiths and such like, but eventually Violet brought in her friend, Dr. Moriarty, who attended the flat at the time the event happened and declared an unpleasant entity had entered the room. When the lights were lowered on his instruction, the others were able to see a dim light where he said the entity was. And when Violet put her hands in this glow, she described it as being like putting her hands into electrically charged water. She would have known how this felt, of course, because it was one of the treatments offered at the Craigside where she grew up. Moriarty was secretive about this method of getting rid of said entity, but get rid of it he did. Violet realised later that he had used the absorption method, although this is difficult and should only be attempted by a very competent adept. She later wrote about this case in Psychic Self-Defence under the chapter Vampirism and again in The Secrets of Dr. Taverner. She wrote it as a fictional story entitled Bloodlust. It is also thought by some that the medical psychological clinic was in fact the fictional care home in the same book, although we will hear later another theory of the care home. In later life, her opinion changed, and she thought surprisingly that more Studley colleges were what was needed. Indeed, she gave her medical analyst employment up, as she felt it was such a poor success rate. When she moved from Freud to Jung, himself a magician, she started to call her study occult science. Using their pseudoscience terminology, she hoped to make magic mainstream. She also felt it helped to draw the right sort of intelligent people towards the enchanted circle that she found herself in, and out of which she never stepped. She was a supporter of the gymnosophists, nudists to you and her time, who planned a mass march on Downing Street. Indeed, the Society of the Inner Light even owned a cabin in the woods at Brickett's Wood nudist camp, as did Gerald Gardner. It was aptly named Avalon, and members would refer to it as Avalon in the Woods. Maybe this was her attempt to retreat instead of Studley College. There's no evidence of Dion and Gerald ever being connected whilst at their properties, though. Not because Violet would be against the Great Rite. Indeed, she was very aware of the value of tantric and Kabbalistic rituals. So we see her gradual change from psychology to occultism. She once said, and through all my experiences, I was learning to interpret occultism in the light of psychology, and psychology in the light of occultism, the one counter-checking and explaining the other. By 1914, Violet was 24 and had left home, but her parents were living in 4 Solershot Hall in the Garden City of Letchworth. It isn't as grand as it sounds. It was a service flat with central kitchen providing meals and a club room for residents. Arthur became known for his chess prowess, and Jenny made some interesting acquaintances. Kitty Tudor Pole being one, who was then acting as guardian of the Grail along with her brother, which John Goodchild had found in Brideswell, Glastonbury. Wellesley Tudor Pole spoke about the Grail in Glastonbury in 1907, and Alice Buckton, who was in the audience, became so fascinated with the Grail that she actually bought Chalice Well in 1912, and by 1914 she had opened it as a hostel for fee-paying guests and a sort of arts and crafts commune. The Tudor Poles and Violet became regular visitors over the years to the site. Alice remained at Chalice Well until she died in 1944. And after her death, Wellesley Tudor Pole et al. Formed a trust to maintain Chalice Well as a holy site, and so it remains today. A second friend was to become one of Violet's teachers, Mayor Tranchell Hayes. She was in some respects the model for Vivian Le Fay Morgan, who we meet in The Sea Priestess and Moon Magic. Whilst these were a previous generation to Violet, they were a big influence on her. Violet attended a theosophical canteen most days, as it was superior food to what she could obtain in the kitchen at Brunswick Square. One day she decided to attend a meeting that was advertised there, more out of curiosity than anything. She went with the idea to Mott, but was surprised to find in the meditation class she was easily able to receive the projected thought forms. She declared that she was dealing with something genuine and was honest enough to admit it too, although it would be a further 10 years before she became a member of the society. Violet finally decided she couldn't carry on her work at the clinic at the start of the Great War, and so she volunteered for the Land Army, but she wasn't allowed to fight with the men. She felt nursing or admin duties weren't for her. But it turned out that neither was the Land Army. And after a year where her employer still owed her money, which she eventually got by holding the farm keys over the cesspit and threatening to throw them in, she left with her pay. Some feel this farm was Monk's Farm from descriptions given in the Goatfoot God. The village of Thorley, the Green Man Pub and Tilty Abbey were also mentioned in the same work. But then in another article, she claimed her time in the Land Army allowed her to understand the servant's point of view, as although she was a lady gardener, she had to enter the house by the rear door and have contact with the servants. She claimed in this article she was there for 3 years though, so this would lead one to think more of Stansted Hall, which was just down the road and interestingly became the first residential training college for spiritualist mediums shortly after Violet's death. She got a job still of national importance, but in the food production department, whose aim it was to find alternative sources of nutrition for people should there be German blockades. She was probably given this cushion of the job to keep her quiet after complaining about her former employer. This job involved her being in charge of a laboratory where she spent long hours in a big, empty, quiet building, waiting and watching bacterial cultures brew in an incubator. This enabled her astral light to suddenly be opened, something for which she was totally unprepared, so became quite frightened. The only place she knew to turn for answers and explanations was the Theosophical Society. So as soon as she could, she went to the library in Tavistock Square and browsed. She discovered Annie Besant's book, The Ancient Wisdom. This introduced her to the concept of the masters teaching and guiding the evolution of humanity. She became somewhat obsessed with the masters. She ate, slept, and most importantly, dreamed them. After 10 days or so of these dreams, she found herself on a plateau in the Himalayas. And there before her were 2 men. One she felt was the Master Jesus, who was given the title of Most Holy Lord of Compassion. The second she would come to know as the Master Riposi, or the Master R, as Theosophists would refer to him, because they're quite fond of hiding things to the uninitiated. With her psychoanalysis training, she knew these beings were real and just on another dimension. During the next 3 days, she got memories of past incarnations right up to her first initiation in Atlantis, and also the memory of the teachings she had received in these lifetimes. She didn't yet turn to the Theosophical Society still, but to Dr. Moriarty. Her life changed greatly from this point on. The violet began to fade away and Dion fortune began to emerge. even though she would have no formal training for a few years. Indeed, the Mastral would be prominent in the society she would eventually form. Even after her death, pupils would cultivate this contact, but she rarely did in the last years of her life. Whilst Dion made no secret of these first two masters, she was very secretive about the three entities she encountered upon Glastonbury tour. In her time in the laboratory, Dion discovered how to make cheese from soya milk, and later set up a company to revolutionise people's eating habits. She published a book in 1925 promoting the Garden City Pure Food Company, which manufactured pure vegetarian foods from the soybean. An advert appearing in the Off-Put Review in 1924 announced the sole distributors of their plain and malted soy milk and cream, pure vegetarian butter substitute, and soya flour for bread and cakes. Firth Weir and Co Limited, the Westminster Bridge Road, Violet's parents' address before they moved to Letchworth. This company was sadly decades ahead of its time, and sadly never took off as a business proposition. She was never a good businesswoman, but then never needed to be. As always, when a teacher is needed, they will appear to you, and she didn't yet turn to the Theosophical Society, but to Dr. Moriarty, who had given her proof of his occult ability previously. Whilst not doubting his occult powers, he was somewhat of a dubious character, even fibbing his way to the title doctor. He was rather penniless when he returned to England, and was almost certainly heavily supported by the three Allen sisters. It's almost certain it is through one of these Francis Allen's daughters that Dion met him. Elsie Reeves, née Allen, was probably the one who introduced Dion to the family, as her husband was a consulting surgeon at the Royal Free Hospital. She facilitated residential workshops at the Orchard in Eversley, Hampshire. Moriarty was known to draw pentagrams on door lintels to control unstable and recalcitrant pupils. Incidentally, I don't think that works anymore because Mike Harris has just been up in court for taking a gun to his neighbours, and he was a big fan of, he was a member of the Society of the Inner Light before he set up his own society. Ursula Ellen Williams, the second sister, could have easily been the one responsible for Violet meeting Moriarty, as she lived near to Violet's parents, and she provided a large shed at the bottom of the garden of her garden in Inverness Terrace, West London, only one street away from where Dion's headquarters would later be in Queensborough Terrace. Gwen Stafford Allen, whose husband was a manufacturer and grower of medicinal herbs, she permitted Moriarty to run a science, arts and crafts society from her home, the Grange, Bishop Stortford. He ran this very much on Gurdjieff lines and got his pupils to work in areas that were alien to them. This was near to where Violet would serve her time in the Land Army. It was even thought that Gwen would carry on after Dr. Moriarty because she was his favourite pupil. These three centres together formed the nursing home spoken of being run by Dr. Taverner. There is a famous picture of the three sisters and some other pupils of Moriarty. One is believed to be Aunt B. Dion. I'll let you decide. Dion parted company with Moriarty when she joined the Golden Dawn in 1919. But just prior to her leaving him, Moriarty formed a Masonic structured lodge in Sinclair Road, Hammersmith. Whilst it accepted women as well as men, it wasn't part of co-masonry. It had 8 ritual officers listed, mainly women. The adeptus was, of course, Moriarty, and Violet Firth is listed as junior warden. Theodore William Cart Moriarty died of angina pectoris on the 18th of August 1923 in the Duke's Head Hotel, King's Lynn. Violet did, however, go to one of his memorial services and announced to those there that the master was dead and they should now follow her, and some of them did. The same time as Moriarty's group, she also joined another group run by B.P. Wadian. He was born in Bombay in 1881, the eldest son of a successful businessman. In 1904, he was an enthusiastic member of the Theosophical Society, so much so that by 1907 he moved to Adir, Madras, to work in their headquarters. He was also closely involved with Indian Home Rule movement and was interned with Annie Besant and George Arundel by the British. In 1919, he came to attend a conference on the trade union movement in Europe, and whilst in England, took the opportunity to form a group to assist Westerners in connecting with the Himalayan masters who were behind the Theosophical Society, of course. At first, Violet vouched for the genuineness of this group and felt some kind of contact, although not sure what it was exactly. She became uneasy when he was trying to control events, meditating upon the group soul of the British nation. He felt it needed redemption and regeneration, which he was intending to supply. Violet couldn't comprehend how someone who disliked it so much could genuinely help the group British soul. She felt he was pushing the West to accept spiritual supremacy of the East, and soon realised she was actually the only English person present. Wendy, sensing her unease, asked her to withdraw from the group, which she did with alacrity. A few days later, when sitting with a friend as dusk was approaching, they became aware of an antagonistic presence in the room, which Violet recognised as being Mr. Wadier in an egg-shaped sphere of misty yellow light. Violet asked her friend to wait outside and quickly made the sign of the pentagram, as Moriarty had taught her to do. The apparition shattered and disappeared and was accompanied by a loud crack, which turned out to be a split in the door panel. At this time, she had no inner contacts of her own, really, Moriarty never having shared his with the group. But Violet just put out a general call for help on the inner plane. She was quite surprised to hear a voice in her head telling her to go to Colonel Fuller. She didn't much fancy this, as she had met him once before and found him quite an formidable gent. He was quite well known in Upper circles, as he had been writing a long dissertation in 1907 entitled The Star of the West. It was a very critical essay upon the great beast himself, Alistair Crowley. So Violet told her in a voice she would need a sign before doing so. She was duly told he would be at her next lecture. She felt confident that he wouldn't be, as she was aware his regiment had been ordered abroad, and presumably him with it. But to her surprise, he was at the next lecture. And when she approached him, he informed her he had been expecting her to do so. Having heard her story, he told her to leave it with him, and it then transpired Wady left the country a few days later. It's interesting that during this time, Violet was also attending meetings at the Christian Mystic Lodge of the Theosophical Society in London, where she was somewhat of a shining light. The Master Jesus instructed her to attend and duly gave her signs as she asked for, as always, to ensure her imagination wasn't playing tricks. So it came about, the two people recommending her membership duly stepped forward, offering to do so, as she was told they would be. The lodge was formed in 1923 by Mrs. Daisy M. Grove. Although they produced monthly magazines, none seemed to have survived, which is convenient for Violet, as she tried to hide that part of her life. By 1924, she was even president of the society, but later left this as well, claiming disagreements with Ledbetter and Annie Besant. She even publicly tried to shame Ledbetter, saying he practiced the black magic. But she never really fell out with the Theosophical Society as such, just some of its members, who she felt went away from HVB's teaching. In 1924, with Loveday's help, Dion bought a 40-foot hut that was previously an officer's mess and had it put on Chalice Orchard, a plot of land at the base of the Torrent next to Chalice Well, that was owned by her friend, of course. This was open to general public from Whitsuntide to Michaelmas as a hostel and pilgrimage centre. The cost was £2, 12 shillings and sixpence, or £2.63 per week. She was pedantic about the positioning of this hut and had 2 balconies added and softened it with plants covering it. It was at this time she wrote Avalon of the Heart, because she felt whilst London was the head of the nation, Glastonbury was the heart. Hence why she had working temples in both places. Some 5 months after getting Wadier banished from the UK, Violet's inner voice told her again to seek help in the matter, but from a different adept. She never named them, but it was almost certainly J.W. Brodie Imes, who was the head of the Alpha et Omega Temple of the Stella Matutinum, formerly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Her friend Mayor Curtis Webb was probably the one who introduced her not only to Brody Irons, but the order itself. It was a requirement of her initiation into the order that she adopted a motto to work with. This was meant as a technical device to work with a body of light. Lots of them used the family motto as their aspirational name, as did Violet. Dio non fortuna, God not luck. Given to her family by her paternal grandfather to show they had risen above being working class. She then adapted it slightly to her pen name of Dion Fortune when she began writing her books on the occult. Was it coincidence that Wendy had slipped back into the country at the time of the second consultation, rather than the psychic attack that was perceived at the time? It was more likely to be they found themselves at two conflicting edges of tectonic plates on the inner planes. The matter never really resolved itself. Wendy was a respected member of the Theosophical Society for over 18 years, and at least he lived to see Indian independence in 1947, which he'd worked so hard and long for, before he passed away in 1958. But it did help Dion find the order where she said she felt as though she had finally come home. Joining them also healed the leak in her aura caused by the incidents at Studley College. Soon after Dion's initiation, Moyna McGregor Mathers took over the running of the London Lodge, her husband having passed away in Paris the previous year. Dion worked mainly with Mary Curtis Webb whilst in the society, who later became Mrs. Transhaw Hayes. Whilst she was in the society, but she found it rather tame compared to what she'd been doing with Moriarty. When rumours started of Gasp Horror's sexual relationship with Maya and Dion began, which wasn't helped by Crowley stating publicly that Maya was a lesbian, Rich coming from a known bisexual, and Dion, by her own admission, was being rather manly. It was neither proved or disproved, but it didn't help Dion's popularity within the group. Many even thinking she was not much good at magic. Moyna Mathers never got along with her, and even expelled Dion from the group for writing the esoteric philosophy of love and marriage, on the grounds that she was betraying the inner teachings of the order. Although she was pardoned when it was pointed out that Dion didn't actually have the degree in which those teachings were given. She was suspended again for some months when she wrote Sane Occultism, and finally turned out altogether for certain symbols not appearing in her aura, which was a perfectly unanswerable charge. Some claim the real reason was because Moyna had been shown a rough draft of the Cosmic Doctrine. Dion didn't really look back, feeling the glory had departed the society when its founding members either died or withdrew from it, leaving it, in her opinion, to be manned mainly by widows and grey-bearded ancients. When in 1927 she attained Adeptus Minor within the society, she was encouraged to start her own outer court of the Golden Dawn, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, later to become the Society of the Inner Light, but then no longer received any support from the Golden Dawn after her expulsion, of course. The main thing Dion took from her Golden Dawn days was the Kabbalah. She had by now taken up residence at 3 Queensborough Terrace, which was inherited in 1924 by Charles Thomas Loveday. Dion lived there and ran her group from there, which at this time was known as the Christian Mystic Lodge of the Theosophical Society, just as the Masters had told the group would happen some months previously. Although she describes in Psychic Self-Defense how she was bothered by black cats on every windowsill, and the smell was not pleasant throughout the house. One morning she met a giant tabby the size of a tiger coming down the stairs. At this point she realised she was being attacked by some of the adepts of Golden Dawn, and immediately did an exorcism, and where, when she and an assistant had looked out of the window and could see nothing but black cats in the street, after the banishing there wasn't a cat to be seen. As it was approaching the vernal equinox, the time of year when adepts meet on the astral plane, she knew it wouldn't be the end of the matter though. So on the equinox, she gathered her little group around her and journeyed to the astral plane, where her opponent appeared in her ceremonial robes and forbid Dion entry along those paths. This was the worst thing you could say to the headstrong Dion, who also knew if she didn't return and do battle now, the astral plane would be forbidden to her forever in this lifetime at least. So after gathering her group once again, who had become scattered and disorientated with the struggle she encountered in the first try, she was able to pass through on the next attempt and receive the visions and messages of the inner chiefs. That was the end of the matter for Dion and that adversary, except that when she undressed to bed that night, her back felt sore, and on looking in the mirror, she found huge scratches like those left by a cat. Was it coincidence that Annie Horniman, whose wealth supported the necklace in the Golden Dawn in the early days, and was always nicknamed Tabby or Puss, was she still supporting the Golden Dawn and Moyna, but by other means now? Melchizedek was the first master of the Society of the Inner Light worked with. This was probably due to her being familiar with him whilst working with Moriarty. The esoteric theory of Melchizedek is that he came to Earth from Venus, bringing a life force with him. If you consider it in theosophical terms, the life force travelled like an electric current around the solar system, energizing each planet in turn. Charles Seymour and Christine Hartley also worked with him during their time in the Society of the Inner Light. Life Bond, among others, helped her to find the other three she worked with within her society, which she called the Watchers of Avalon. Socrates was the first one. The second was Thomas Erskine, who was Lord Chancellor in 1806. But it was thought to be Thomas More in a previous manifestation, who was also Lord Chancellor, but in 1529. David Carstairs was the third, and a bit of an odyssey. He came to Dion claiming to have been a casualty of World War I. But no record could be found of anyone of that name being killed either in the battlefields or anywhere else during the war. He was a cheeky chappie, and the lodge members enjoyed working with him, regardless of his dubiousness. He once got Dion in full trance to go outside to a car and drive it through London. Not long after Dr. Thomas Penry Evans, a Welsh medical doctor of a middle-class background, joined the group in 1925, who eventually joined in matrimony with Dion when she became Mrs. Thomas Penry Evans on 7th of April 1927 at Paddington Registry Office. He was 34 and Dion 36 by this time. Dion's father and Penry's sister Hazel were the witnesses. The only pictures to survive seems to have been taken at Chalice Well, which is possibly whilst on their honeymoon. Dion wrote that the mating of an occultist was so much more than an ordinary mating. Dion also began more dark ways in her occult practice. Once Penry Evans, who was known as Merle in the group, joined. Up until his arrival in the group and life, she was very Christian in her beliefs. But Merle forced her to recognise and take stock of the dark areas within her own psyche. He would also have made her acknowledge her birthland, even if he did mock her, being from the more genteel North Wales town of Llandudno, as opposed to his good Celtic roots of Pontarddulus. They worked well together, and Dion would channel a master of medicine for Penry. He was thought to be a Hungarian physician. He would pass advice to Penry Evans through Dion that he could understand and act upon. Merle didn't particularly get along with the group, and some felt he didn't fit in well with the close relationship the group had during the war years, which incidentally Penry had fought in. He was praised for his kind nature and eloquent speaking voice, though. Many felt he was henpecked. It was through these masters that Dion claimed to have written the Cosmic Doctrine, which she felt was the equivalent of Madame Blavatsky's secret doctrine. As in it being dictated by masters, I suppose it was. It also resembled Moriarty's teaching, but some feel that he was the one doing the dictating after his passing. In 1927, Dion felt secure enough with her base at 3 Queensborough Terrace, commonly known as 3QT, and her marriage to a respectable businessman, to ditch the Theosophical Society, and she knew the Golden Dawn was about to do the same to her. So in October, she gave a series of 5 lectures at 3QT and 2 spiritualist meeting places. I presume she would also have given demonstrations of her mediumship. Her method of working as a medium was to rise up on the planes, taking her consciousness beyond the earth sphere and closer to the pure levels of the masters. The 500 copies of the Society's magazine that they printed and kept on the altar were gone within 2 weeks, and they had to do a reprint for those interested. The prayer of consecration the group said over the magazines obviously magnetised them enough to draw the people toward her and their new group. 3QT had a hypnotic quality from the time the Enquirer walked between the two columns which formed the porch, which Dion used as a symbolic island gate to the other world. The Monday evenings would regularly draw upwards of 30 people, who all would be transfixed as Dion would parade in front of them in a bright red, blue or blue caftan, which made her stand out as it was the Depression times after the war, so clothing was generally pretty drab. You could be an associate member for this. You would receive the monthly magazine. They could enroll in study classes. They could attend certain meetings, not open to the general public. They gained access to certain sections of the inner library, and they received the annual report. You couldn't become a full member until you had passed the study course, which was in 3 parts, all related to the first 3 levels on the Tree of Life, and consisted mainly of studying the cosmic doctrine, which at this point wasn't published, but handed out a few chapters at a time. The second part was run by Edward Maltby, who had married Merle's sister Hazel. He taught basic visualization work and information on the planets, occult anatomy of man, breathing techniques, and general Kabbalistic knowledge. It was only on the 3rd level of the tree that the student could participate in ritual work. It would take 9 months for the course, which is the traditional gestation period of the magical groups. In 1930, Dion leased a property called the Belfry, a former Presbyterian church, which was situated in West Halkin Street off Belgrave Square. She felt it would be a boat hole of sorts for herself, and she would only invite a few select people for special purposes, mainly those dedicated to Egyptian workings. Crowley once attended one of Dean's lectures here. He tried to thrust a copy of his book, Word of the Equinox, into her hands, but she refused, worried he would then have a link to her. After cleansing the place using the banishing ritual of pentagram from any spiritualistic workings, she began her meditations and rites, which would slowly attune the place to the worship of the goddess Isis. Thus, her own temple of Isis was created. She even had a lift installed at great expense, just so she could be seen to rise and become unveiled as Isis once was. Dion also entered her most prolific writing period. Paganism was good for her. By 1932, Dion was beginning to change direction again. The Society of the Inner Light was on a solid financial footing, and the mystical Kabbalah was well underway. Through the Gates of Death had been published. Her appeal to raise £150 to build a sanctuary in the Chalice Orchard was doing well, and had raised £113 to finish the sanctuary in the Chalice Orchard, to finish and equip it. She was at the peak of her powers almost, but doubt as to whether she would be able to keep Merle crept in. She even confided to close friends she had married him for his powers, not love. She also felt when the mystical Kabbalah was published, she would lose her powers for breaking her oath she had taken in the Golden Dawn to keep such things secret. The gossip of Merle's philandering had begun, although never proved. Dion and Merle's marriage lasted a mere 12 years. In 1938, when The Sea Priestess was published, Dion decided to revisit her childhood hometown in Llandudno. She sent the editor of the local paper a copy of the book, and she gave a lecture at the Swiss Cafe St. George's Place entitled Occultism, Past and Present. Did she wish to work some magic on the Great Orm, or just feel she was paying the town back for the experience of growing up with the sea that enabled her to writing of the book? Colonel Seymour was to be the 3rd man Dion would work with on an equal footing, and the last man to neither be afraid of her or idolise her. Like Moriarty and Merle, he was a proud Celt. He was initiated into the Society of the Inner Light in January 1933 and worked through to 3rd degree in 10 months, ranking 2nd in the ritual scheme of things. In Dion's most prolific period of writing in the 1930s, she found herself an agent in the shape of Christine Campbell Thompson. Over their long lunches, putting finishing touches to her books, Dion managed to persuade CCT to join her little group at 3QT. Brody Hines had often tried to persuade CCT to join his magical group, but had never managed to, so it was quite a feather in Dion's cap. However, it wasn't long before Dion became jealous of the attention she was giving Merle and trying to work with him. So she made a pairing in July 1937 that would last their lifetimes when she paired her with Colonel Seymour. They would work late into the night in Seymour's rooms, which he rented in 2QT. They were the only pair to ever cause a schism within Dion's group. When she became jealous and suspicious of the splinter group they seemed to be forming in his rooms next door, where once she supported him and even worked intimately on a magical level with him, she now allowed rumours of the old Marge working more magic for his priestesses next door. The onset of the Second World War allowed Seymour a dignified exit from the inner light, as he was transferred to Liverpool to do work for the War Office, intercepting messages and ensure there were no conspiracies between any British or Germanic secret societies. Ironically, when the bombing became too bad in Liverpool, he was transferred to the Craigside Hydro in Llandudno, which was, of course, formerly owned by Dion's family. But he never returned to Dion. Once Merle and Seymour had left Dion's side, she seemed to return to her Christian workings. In some ways, the war was good for Dion. It gave her a focus and forced her to take action and help in the only way she knew how. Whilst its immediate effect was to fracture the inner light with the men young enough to fight going off to enlist, the group as it was would never be the same again. She was left with Creasy and Loveday and a few women. She was adamant that she would remain in London. The gods she now called on were very British, Boadicea, King Arthur and Merlin. Dion felt she knew just the cave Arthur and his knights were residing in, and where the horn was that needed to be blown to bring them into action, under her beloved Tor, of course. Paper was in such short supply, she ceased publication of the magazine in order to send a letter out to members, so that the rawest neophyte could practice magic on equal terms with the most competent adept. The letters were sent out weekly on a Wednesday to ensure reaching their destination in time for Sunday. The first being dated 8th of October 1939. It instructed the participants to sit or lie in a relaxed state, feet together and hands clasped on top of the letter whilst facing London at precisely 12:15. Those who remained in London would be generating power within the sanctuary at 3QT at this time, and thus creating a link between this new group and the group soul of the race itself. The symbol that linked them all was the rose upon the cross, and the first session lasted 15 minutes and enabled them to link to each other, but also the large soul of Britain, thus enabling contact with spiritual influences at work behind the scenes. The Watchers of Avalon were back in force. 27th of October saw 3QT become bombed out, but thankfully with no casualties. Dion moved as far as 21BQT. She had several rather amicable meetings with Alistair Crowley during the war years. They even exchanged books. He gave her the book of Thoth she inscribed with the Priestess of Selene, and she sent him a copy of the Sea Priestess. Dion dropped a brooch at one of their meetings, and after retrieving it for her, Crowley said that a decade or so ago he would have consecrated it for her. Quick as a flash, she replied 10 years ago she would have done it herself. Dion was not a well woman in the last years, but would insist it was nothing more than a heavy cold. And indeed, the leukemia did only have an effect in the last weeks of her life. It amused her greatly to find the staff nicknamed her the Fluff in her later days, because of her habit of going round and rubbing her fingers over items and declaring fluff. Uncle Robbie, a member of the Inner Light, was the one who would declare she was dying, after she had gone to him with a toothache due to him being the retired dentist and by then living in rooms at 3QT. Nobody quite knows how he came to the conclusion, but he was to declare, "By Christ, she's had it," when he returned alone to the room where the rest of the group were. She was admitted to Middlesex Hospital in January of 1946 in the heart of London, the City of the Moon. as the inner light left her, making her appear truly beautiful before the daughter of heaven and earth moved on, and glad to be going. She left all her money to Chichester and Creasy for the furtherance of the work in the inner light, plus a small regular sum to her cousin Enid, Mary Chambers, her childhood playmate in Candudno. Such a short life, a mere 57 years, but what fulfilled years they were. Dion defined magic as the art of causing changes to occur in consciousness. And that's what she did as a magician and occultist. Thank you all for your attention.
Are they still here?
Thank you, Dee.
Was it worth waiting for, Jenny?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was interesting because I've read some books, but I didn't know very much about the person. So lots to go away and have a think about there. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
You like glaring over you.
Oh, sorry. Not better.
Yes, I apologise for the hiccups in the slides. That's the second time it's done it on me.
We'll let you off.
Technology does it.
Yeah, and I apologise for the ineptability of the bloody staff. You can't get decent staff nowadays.
That's marriage, it does it as well.
Says somebody hiding behind the door.
Yeah, he's gone again. Can't keep still.
Out of striking distance.
I'm still gobsmacked. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah?
Did you enjoy it, Trev?
What are you gobsmacked at, Trev, that I can read, or about Dion Fortune?
You could put it as a book, you know.
She was a fascinating woman, wasn't she? She certainly fascinated me enough to want to do the talk. And I thoroughly enjoyed all the research I did for it.
Yeah. But that could be a book. I'd buy a copy.
You buy any rubbish, we've seen that from the mail you're opening today.
What got you interested in Dion Fortune, Dee? What set you off on being interested in her particularly?
I went to the esoteric conference in Ludlow, and there was a chap there doing a talk. Wasn't doing it on Dion Fortune, he was doing it on William Gray. And I researched into other books that he did, and one was an autobiography, a biography rather of Dion Fortune.
Okay.
I thought, oh, I'll read that one. I like her because I'd already read her books.
Yeah.
And so I read that, and then I sort of collected all biographies that are done on Dion Fortune, and gradually learned more and more about her over the years. So yeah, I mean, I think at books.
Do you know if she came across Madeline Montalban at all?
I've not come across any connection between the two. I do know about Madeline Montalban, but I've not been aware of any connection between the two.
I've looked it up, but I'm interested to see if their dates are sort of quite similar, because you assume that there weren't that many magical women, but actually there were.
Yes, exactly. And it wouldn't be unheard of for them to have come in contact, because of course magical circles were much smaller in those days than they are even today. And you know how much you come across people today, sort of thing, you know.
Yeah. Madeline was born 1910 and died 1982.
It is possible.
Yeah.
Because 1946 Dion died, so
maybe
it's possible, but I would think unlikely. I would think she's probably been more of an influence to Madeline through her books.
Yeah.
Because I mean, even her storybooks sort of thing, you know, the novels, they've got so much magical info in them for people, you know. It's a shame that people don't bother with them nowadays because they feel they're difficult to read.
There's all sorts of things that I've heard people say about Dion Fortune's work now, that, you know, that it's, you know, culturally inappropriate and all of that kind of malarkey, but you just have to take it for the time it was written in and the times that there were then, don't you? You can't put today's slant on it.
I think everyone's
Well, of course not, because
the time, aren't they, for the start? Not just Dion, but everyone around there as well.
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, she wouldn't have considered herself a racist. She was just very much for the British Empire. And consequently, she felt what we were doing with the countries in the British Empire, we were doing for the people's good. She didn't see that it was wrong, sort of thing, you know. But I mean, obviously, with hindsight, it was very wrong. But she didn't view it that way. She didn't feel she was being unjust to people, or the British Empire were being unjust to people. She just supported the British Empire, which was why she was against Annie Besant and Wendy and that, you know. But I mean, you know, again, I mean, the things she was doing in the psychology clinic sort of thing, you know. I mean, can you imagine the horror of it? People were masturbating, dear God. You know, shock, horror, scandal, because that's why I put that sort of thing in it, because it wasn't just the racism and things with her. You know, it was the psychology and that was so different in those days.
Well, people were committed to asylums for being a single mum, weren't they?
Yes.
Exactly. You know, I mean, can you imagine somebody daring to open a school for neurotic young girls nowadays?
It's called St. Trinian's.
That Studley Castle is now a hotel. We've stayed there.
Oh, did you?
We stayed there last year, yes. One of the turrets.
Oh, how lovely.
We might have even stayed in the same room. Who knows?
I might have played piano where Dion was doing a thingy. Yes.
I remember those pictures of that, Steve.
The peacock room. Flamingo.
It's
I found it very interesting that Dion was very kind of into the whole Druids and Welsh Druids kind of link to Glastonbury. And I've always kind of poo-pooed it really and kind of gone, yeah, fuck that, that's a load of poo. But I've kind of quite got into it recently. It ties into some of the stuff I'll be talking about with the whole touch stuff that I'm doing in July.
yeah. And also, she sort of went against the Theosophical Society because she felt they were working with the Eastern Masters and she wanted to work with the Western.
Yes.
It was the same sort of thing as Blavatsky was doing, just with the Western Masters.
Yes, masters being the operative word.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's terminology, isn't it? It's you know, how hung up are you going to get with the terminology sort of thing, you know?
Yeah, we tell some of them who have trouble with the word masters, another word is teacher.
Absolutely.
And they can understand that better.
It's beyond gender, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Exactly, you know. But if you sort of overlook some of the terminology and things, her work has still got value today.
Definitely.
You know, it's influenced a lot of magic that's come forward from that.
Psychic Self-Defense was one of the first books I read.
Yeah.
It started that and That and Dennis Wheatley combined together started my little journey off in my early teens.
Yeah, I mean, the first book that I ever really read, or serious book that I ever really read, was Regarde's Tree of Life.
Oh yeah, that was in the list somewhere. Central.
But you see, then again, she was very friendly with Regarde in the Golden Dawn.
Yeah, exactly. It all links together.
Exactly. And all three founders of the Golden Dawn were all theosophists.
Yeah. And Masons.
Yeah.
You know, so it does all, you know, just sort of link in one quite small circle, really, doesn't it? And at the end of the day, all the splinter groups were all done because of people wanting the power for themselves.
Yeah. Yes, I could do it better than you, so I'm going to go and call it something else and set up over there.
Exactly. You know, I mean, look at the Druids nowadays. Look at all the Druid splinter groups you've got going. You know, it's now I'm not speaking to you, and my robe's better than your robe, and
Exactly the same in Wicca.
well, exactly. You know, you've got Gardnerian and Alexandrian with Wicca, haven't you? Sort of thing. It's
And all the others.
well, yeah. I mean, nowadays you just lock yourself in a cupboard for 13 days, don't you?
Are you trying to show us something, Trevor?
It's bricky
Yeah, I'm
wood.
just having a look at Bricket Wood. Is that the same Bricket Wood that you had in your talk?
Yes.
Yes.
Trust you to go into the bloody nudist bit, Trevor.
Whose cottage
Yeah.
is that?
No, I've just got it here.
That's Gerald's.
That's the one I showed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you've got a colour one there.
Was that in your Saga magazine, Trevor?
Yeah, no, it's only the Pagan Dawn. It's the Beltane one.
Oh yes, I read that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good article.
Hmm.
Gerald was cottaging in Bricket Woods.
Yeah.
Just trying to keep up with it all.
Typically, you picking up on the nudist bit.
Well, what can I say? I'll be back in a minute. I'm going to go and stir the stew.
Okay, Trev.
We have got a road trip planned.
Yeah, we can't share it though.
Because some of them pictures are basically I've grabbed off the net, but we plan to go down that area and get our own photographs.
Yeah, do it. It's worth it.
Do what, sorry?
Your own photographs.
Okay, Patty, I've vaguely seen your message.
I don't know that
I'll
there's
catch
much
you again.
left now, is there, Bricket Wood?
Well, we won't get into that bit, but we'll get round Green Down and that place, you know, the tour.
Yes, it's
It
worth
seems to have this fantastic idea that I'm going to be able to walk out onto the tour. Not the tour,
No, I
Green
know
Down.
you won't get out on Green Down. You've got no chance of Green Down.
No, I'm just taking my book so I can sit in the car and read while that idiot goes with the camera.
Hey, there is a road that goes up. If you talk nicely to them, it's the National Trust. They might drive you up
Ah,
because
might have a word.
there's steps that go up, but equally there is an access road as well. So if you talk to the guys in the National Trust car park, there wasn't a buggy, but there was a guy in the National Trust van. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility if you ask in advance.
Oh, okay, this might be worth thinking about then, Jen, but I'll still take my book just in case.
Yeah, do it. So are you planning a road trip then?
Yeah, most likely.
It's a very strange. I've been down to that fort a couple of times, and having read The Sea Priestess, I had something different in my head to what I saw when I got there.
It's the Fort Post priestess.
No,
It's a
no,
new
no,
version.
no, it's not.
It is the same one.
It was
Someone was saying that, weren't they?
it was pretty new when Dion was writing
Right.
the book, and you imagine it being ruined, and it wasn't. It was it's very concrete. It's
it's a 19.
no, it's earlier than that, but
Is
it's
18 something?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
very of its time. It's not kind of like an old fort that you might associate with magical occulty
no.
thing. It's
No, of course it isn't, because her family supplied the steel for the guns and that, you know. I find it interesting that all the places she sort of liked, and of course the Ormes, is all the same rock.
Yes, and it's interesting to do with the Michael rocks and everything, which ties into the back end of the stuff that I'm doing, which is the Mary line version of that up here. So similar kind of stuff. It's all tuts and toots.
Yeah, they're all connected,
Yeah,
aren't they? The Michael and the Mary
think-
lines.
I think that she sort of had teachers throughout her life teaching her things that she's eventually put together in later life, you know.
Yeah, she's been influenced obviously by a lot of people, hasn't she? And picked up a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. And psychically picked up a lot of stuff, and a lot of different things along the way. It's not just one thing. And you kind of we go around kind of knocking her for the whole Christian kind of stuff, and that was mainly her fault for denying it, really, wasn't it, in certain instances? But obviously, there's links there in the Christian mysticism that's quite important, that kind of backs up some of the stuff that she was coming in with.
That's, oh yeah, you can turn the record. Sorry, Greg's just saying turn the recording on.